Okay, so today we're going to talk about Module 4, Lesson 1, which is an introduction to decimals and the order of operations. And going to be a lot of calculator work in this lesson. So you do need to know how to use it. So I'm going to show you some calculator tips along with some key terms as well. So when we're dealing with decimals, we can look at a something like this. We'll have the decimal point in there, right? And the different place values have names. Like this first one after here would be the tenths. We're going to have this TH at the end of these. This is the hundredths. Okay, the next one will be thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, and then they continue on, just like they do when we're going to the left, just kind of in the opposite direction. You'll notice there's no ones place, so that's something that's a little different for some people. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. When we're dealing with decimals, these are going to work very similarly to fractions in that they are ways to represent parts of whole numbers, okay? And we're going to ask you to write these numbers in word form sometimes, like if we give you something like this, okay? We're going to start with 18. Okay, and then whenever we have a decimal point and we're trying to write it out in words, we're going to use the word and in that place. Okay, and then over here, the 37, we're going to write that out. And then we're going to use the last place value that shows up here to name the whole decimal part of this number. So it's the second spot here, tenths, hundredths. So this is 18 and 37 hundredths is how we would read this thing, okay? We might ask you to go the other way as well. We might ask you to go with 5, and this is actually trickier than it looks. So if we ask you to do 5 and 3 hundredths, okay, well, it's pretty easy to start. We're just going to start with the 5, and then the word and tells us that we're going to have a decimal there. And then the 3 hundredths, though, is trickier than it looks like, because a lot of people will just put a 3 here. But that would not be correct, because the hundredth spot, this is the tenths and this is the hundredths, and that 3 has got to go into the hundredths spot. And so we need a 0 placeholder in there to take that into account to make sure we get everything accounted for there. Okay, so when you're going this direction, make sure you just kind of figure out where that hundredth spot is, get your last digit into that appropriate spot, and work from there. Okay, so we're going to ask you to do some rounding in this lesson as well. It's very common when we're dealing with decimals. We might ask you to do something like this 0.39325. We might ask you to round this to the nearest thousandth. Okay, if we're asking you to round the nearest thousandth, the first thing we have to do is we have to locate that thousandth spot. So tenths, hundredths, thousandths, this is it right here, okay? And then we have two choices when we're rounding. We're going to either keep the value the same, or we're going to round it up to the next value, okay? And the way that we're going to decide that is we're going to use the number after it. If it's 5 or greater, then this number will go up, and if it's not, then it'll stay the same. So in this case, that 2 is not 5 or greater, so we're going to leave that value the same, so that's 0.393 to the nearest thousandth. It's important in problems like this to make sure you're locating the right place value to work from. Okay, let's do another one. Okay, so let's take this, let's round this to the nearest cent. Okay, so this is a money application of this, and this is something that's pretty common to see in businesses. Have to round off to the nearest cent, so you got to find that cent spot is the 2 spots after the decimal. Okay, so again, we're going to look at the next spot over. If it's 5 or bigger, we're going to go up, and in this case it is 5 exactly, so we're going to go up to $9.28. Okay, so we're definitely going to have to do a little rounding. That's kind of the idea there. Okay. Alright, so could also ask you to do something, you really want to pay attention, because I can ask you a very similar question like this, 71.8254, but I can ask you to round it to the nearest dollar, right? And that means I'm actually rounding over here, and I'm using this value here to decide whether to go up or not. And again, because it's 5 or greater, we are going to go up, and our answer here is going to be 72. So I can ask you, I could have given you this exact same value, asked you to round it to the nearest cent, and the answer would have looked very different. So you do need to pay attention to your instructions. Make sure you're rounding to the appropriate spot there to get these things right. Okay? So fractions and decimals can be used in very similar ways. They both kind of represent parts of whole numbers, right? And so we need to be able to switch back and forth between them, and this is where your calculator is going to be pretty important. So if I ask you to take 11 over 12, which is a fraction like we were dealing with in Module 3, and change it into a decimal, well, that is to me just 100% a calculator problem. There's a couple of choices for how to do that. If I want to, I can just do 11 divided by 12 in my calculator, and then I do need to pay attention to my rounding instructions here. Okay? Now this is something that happens pretty often with these. You'll notice how we've got just a bunch of 6s, and then we got a 7 at the end, but really that's just a rounded 6. The 6s actually keep going forever. So if we were to kind of think about what this really means, it's 0.916, and then those 6s just repeat forever. And we have a notation for that. Anytime we have a value in a decimal that repeats forever, we just put a little bar over it like this, okay? And we call this a repeating decimal, and it happens very often. In fact, all fractions can be changed either to a decimal that terminates or repeats. And so this is very common when we're switching over like this. So 0.916 repeating is going to be our value here. And you just want to put the bar over the 6 because the 6 is the value that repeated whenever we put it in there, okay? It won't always be like that. Sometimes you'll have, 1/4. You want to change that into a decimal. You just do 1 divided by 4 in your calculator. Whoops, sorry, typo there. 1 divided by 4 in our calculator there. And we get a terminating decimal, 0.25. Okay, one just quick note. This 0 at the front here, you'll notice it shows up in your calculator. It's optional. It is not required to be correct in your decimal work. But I do think it's a very good idea to write there, and I'll show you why. Let's say I do something like 2/5. If I want to change that into a decimal, I'll just do my 2 divided by 5 in the calculator, and it gives me 0.4. I can't tell you how often I see this. I just see this little notation with just this pathetic little point down there, and I'm not sure if it's a stray mark or a decimal, right? But even when it's kind of not the most obvious thing, the easiest thing to see, if I put that 0 in the front there, it does make it very clear that I'm looking at a decimal. And so it's just a safer way to write these numbers to avoid potential mistakes, to make sure that people can understand what you're going with, okay? So let's talk about how to go the other direction. Let's say we have a fraction like 0.8, and we want to change it into a decimal. So if I want to do that, okay, what I'm going to do is think about what place value is this last digit in. In this case, it's the first spot after the decimal. That's the 10th spot. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop the decimal point off. I'm just going to take my number. I'm going to put it in my numerator, okay, and then I'm going to put the denominator that's equal to the place value that this last digit is in. So it's in the 10th spot, so this is going to be like 8 over 10, and then I need to reduce to lowest term. So 8 divided by 10, both those divisible by 2, so 8 divided by 2 is 4, 10 divided by 2 is 5, so 4/5 is going to be my answer here. Now, there is kind of an easier way to do this with the calculator again. It's a big part of this lesson, like I mentioned. If I put that 0.8 in there, okay, right here, you'll notice right up above this A, B over C key, okay, this is an option that's going to let us, right here, sorry, above this PRB key, F, arrow, D, okay, that is the option that's going to let you switch fractions to decimals. So if I just hit second to get to the blue option, and then that key and then hit enter, it's going to do it for us. So we do have a button on our calculator right up here that's going to let us convert between fractions and decimals, and it's even going to reduce them down to lowest terms for us. So that's certainly something that if you practice a little bit, get used to how it works in the calculator, can make these questions quite a bit more straightforward. Okay? All right, so we can certainly see problems like this. Negative 2.9 squared. Now this is one that looks simple, but I'll tell you right now that a lot of people will put this in their calculator and they'll get it wrong. Like if you just do this, negative 2.9 squared, and you hit enter, you will get the wrong answer. And the reason for that is you have to have those parentheses in there in order to square the appropriate parts of the problem. So if I do it with a parenthesis, I will get the right answer. So 8.41 is what we want here. Makes sense because if we know that this means negative 2.9 times negative 2.9, and we also know that when we multiply a negative times a negative, we get a positive. So our answer does need to be positive, but those parentheses matter very much in a problem like this. If you leave those out, try to do the whole thing in your calculator, you can certainly get into trouble. Okay? So we might ask you to order some numbers. I'll give you the number 2/3, the number 0.663, and the number 0.669. And I'm going to ask you to put those in order from smallest to largest. Okay, so it's difficult when you have a fraction mixed in. We kind of want to be comparing apples to apples. We want a consistent comparison. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this 2/3 into a decimal. So I'm just going to do 2 divided by 3 in my calculator. Okay, and then we have another one of these repeating decimals. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get as much matched up as I can. So I'm going to write down 2 6s here since I have those consistently in all these problems, and then my next 6, I'm just going to stop there and put my little repeating bar over here. It does keep going. Okay, and now I can make my comparison. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the 10th spot. I'm going to start from the smallest value. They're all the same, so that doesn't help me. Then the hundredths, all the same. Again, doesn't help me. And then the thousandths, though, no, this one has the smallest value in the thousandth spot, so that's the one that we want to start with here. So 0.663 is going to go in first. And then the 2/3, which was this one, is going to go next. And then finally the 0.669 over here is going to be my largest number. So again, you want to make a fair comparison here. You want to be able to you want apples to apples. You don't want different, don't want to be comparing fractions and decimals. You want to be able to get them into the same forms so that they're easier to compare. Okay? Now you will have a few questions in this assignment where we need to remember our order of operations problems. So let's look at a couple of those. So if I'm doing something like this, I want to go through my order of operations. I don't have any operations inside the parentheses. So my first step here is going to be any exponents. And I do have an exponent calculation here, so I'm just going to do that first. 0.8 squared. Again, a lot of calculator work here. So, okay, and then we want to add those together. And we're done. So we just want to go back to what we learned in Module 1 about the order of operations. Those rules have not changed. We're going to do the rules exactly the same way. And it's important not to make this more difficult than it is. Really, the calculator is going to be doing all the heavy lifting for us here. We're just going to put all these decimal calculations right into our calculator. Okay? We might ask you to do something like this. Calculate 4y minus z if y equals 0.3 and z equals negative 3.2. Okay, our first step, this is going to work just like it did when we did this initially. We're going to plug all our values in. They're decimals now, but the calculator is going to handle that part of it for us. Okay, and then I'll put that negative 3.2 in for z. You'll notice I do have those two negatives. I have to have those both in there, or I've got to remember that when I subtract, it's the same as adding the opposite, so I can change them both over if I want. Okay, then we need to make sure we're thinking about our order of operations and doing everything correctly there. So my first step is going to be to do this multiplication over here, and again, just a calculator problem. So 4 times 0.3 will give me 1.2, and then we'll add those together to finish up. So again, we're just thinking about the order of operations the same way we did back in Module 1, going through our process, thinking about our signs, and 4.4 is what we're looking for there. Okay, so hopefully that's enough to get you off to a good start here for this lesson. A lot of calculator work. It is important that you get comfortable with that. And if I can help, please let me know. Have a good day.